Well, good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me to come to us, and I'm really grateful. When Christian asked me to talk about African Christianity, I said to him, maybe we can continue in the spirit of the Reformations, the European Reformations, Protestant Reformations. But we can also talk about African Reformations. So these were the kind of reforms in the church that were imagined and also led by African Christians in response to what they considered the problems with the mission-founded churches. So those were the churches founded by missionaries from Europe and later, of course, from North America. The expansion, though, of Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa and tropical Africa has, in a sense, come as a huge surprise to historians and missiologists. And this was because in 1910, the famous missionary conference that was held in Edinburgh, most of the reports on African missions were not quite optimistic about the growth of Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa. Because of the influence of the expansion of Islam and all the rest of it. And many of them also weren't quite optimistic that Christianity will flourish in tropical Africa without the superstructures of European Christianity. By superstructure, I mean European Christian theology, liturgy, and many thoughts. But we know that all of those reports were wrong. I don't know if you can see this, but in 1910, the famous Edinburgh Conference, sub-Saharan African Christianity had only 1.4% of Christian presence in the world. In 2010, sub-Saharan African Christianity jumped to 23.6. Europe dropped from 66 to 25. And it is growing. In fact, this is done by the Pew Research. They are also projecting, again, we don't know if it is going to be right or wrong, but that by 2060, that 4 in 10 persons in the world will be African Christians. See, it's going to move. Well, these are all projections. But Christianity is expanding. And what is very interesting is that most of these expansions are led by non-mission founded churches. By churches that can be traced back to what I'm calling African Reformations. Just to remind us, not a Sub-Saharan Africa or tropical Africa, I'm actually going to zero in on Sub-Saharan African region, but even at that, I'm going to come to West Africa as well. So we don't have all the time in the world to talk about Christianity in the entirety of Africa. But just to remind us, there are Andrew Walls is one of my favorite mentors, and he's also shaped me in different ways. We have to regard African Christianity, and here he's referring to Christianity in the Sub-Saharan African region, as potentially the representative Christianity of the 21st century because of the rapid growth of Christianity in Sub-Saharan Africa. There are 3 main strands of Christianity in Africa in general. Okay? The Orthodox churches, we may actually trace them back all the way to the 1st century. By Orthodox churches, I'm referring to Coptic churches, Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and all the rest of them. We know that by the 2nd century, that Christianity was well established in Roman North Africa. I'm not going to allow that to detain us. But mission-founded churches, we can trace it back to the 15th century when Europeans explorers had contact with tropical Africa. And African instituted churches, we're also going to zero in on this, we can trace it back to the 19th century as well. But just before we move to Sub-Saharan Africa, sometimes we forget that Christianity was really flourishing in the northern part of Africa before European explorers had contact with the continent of Africa. Tertullian, for example, we know if you think about the Trinity, you probably will mention his name. Many historians believe that he was the very first person to use the word Trinitas, Trinity, to describe God. But these were African theologians. Arius and Athanasius, if you want to talk about the Council of Nicaea, somehow you're going to bring them into conversation as well. These were the Christianity that was going on, taking place, that was flourishing in Alexandria, and so on and so forth. We could also talk about Ethiopia. Some trace it back to the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8 and all the rest of it. And St. Augustine, who is one of the key thinkers that have shaped Western thought, is also an African, if you want to say. So sometimes we talk about these people as they were not part of African history and African story. What has really troubled, though, historians is that Christianity that flourished in the northern part didn't quite come southwest or southward at all. And the reason we've been asking why, there are so many conjectures. I believe that perhaps the one that makes more sense to me was because of the desert, and they didn't have any access really to commerce that can get them across. But when the Arabians introduced camels into the northern African region, they also came with Islam. So it didn't quite let that. We know the rest of the story about how Egypt and when they had contact with Muslims from the Arabian Peninsula as the result of almost a diminishing presence of Christianity in that part of the world. We're not going to allow that to detain us, so we can move straight to the sub-Saharan African region. Lamine Sane, the Gambian historian who teaches at Yale, again describing the European form of Christianity and its contact with Africa, said, historically, mission arrived in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, out of the general expansion of Europe abroad, motivated at first by a desire to circumvent Islam and compensate for Muslim resistance, and also by a desire for economic market, which the maritime discoveries of the 15th century have made accessible. Okay. We know that the first contact with European explorers, some trace it back to 1415, when the Portuguese arrived in Morocco and took over Ceuta, almost like a bloodless battle. And of course, on the side of the Portuguese, the Africans suffered that. So we know during the 15th century, Spain and Portugal were really the powers that led the maritime exploration in African areas, especially the Portuguese. And we also know the result of it, the famous transatlantic trade. Apart from trying to curb the expansion of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa, many of them also were doing exploring market routes as well. Ivory, gold, and at some time it became a war ground for European powers. Of course, we know that in 1884 and 1885 they had to make a decision, the European powers had to make a decision on how to divide Africa, the scramble for Africa and the rest of it. So there are trade and all sorts of things, and some of these ships had chaplains. And the chaplains usually had contact with people in the coastal region. They didn't go inland because they were more interested in the trade routes. We know that one of the devastating consequences of this transatlantic triangle was slave trade. And it was one of the most horrible experiences that Africans suffered during that time. And I think it is estimated that by the time it was officially ended, that close to 11 or more, some say 12 million Africans were transported forcibly from their part of the world to this part of the world, West Indies. I'm moving now straight to West Africa because I think there were Christian presence in the Congo area and all the rest of it, but because of time, I'm just going to zero in West Africa and then highlight Sierra Leone, because it became a center for missions, and Africans led mission expeditions into different parts of Africa. One of the fascinating stuff about this time period. By 1807, the British Parliament, again with the help of several people, ex-slave slaves who persuaded and made case for the abolition of slave trade. By 1807, the British Parliament abolished it, made it illegal, and of course they nudged other countries to get on board. Some joined. I think the U.S. probably joined. The Americans joined independence later, or 1808 or whatever, something like that. But one of the things that happened after that decision was reached was the British Navy was authorized to patrol the Atlantic, and they were also authorized to search ships. In ships that were carrying slaves were confiscated, and the goods were confiscated. But the question is, what do you do with human beings? Because they come from different places. And one of the decisions that was made was, well, perhaps we need to find a place in Africa where we can return them, and create in that place a Christian colony that will be free from slave trade. The model. The decision, of course, was made that Sierra Leone was chosen, and they built this place that is called Freetown in Sierra Leone. It's really surprising that a few work have been really done on this, because that place became a very powerful center for the expansion of Christianity in Africa. Freetown, though, was modeled after the European way of life. Education, clothing, religion, language as well. One of the people that I'm going to talk about today is Samuel Ajayi-Crowther, who was the very first African to be consecrated bishop in the Anglican Church. Grew out of that particular Sierra as well. He studied there, he taught there, and he led missions into places like Nigeria from Sierra Leone. Any quick questions before we move to these individuals? Questions about the way that I've introduced the story? I know it's a quick introduction, but just wanted to make sure that we all the same page.
So Sierra Leone was not a country as we see it now until this happened, until the slave trade happened, and people returned.
Well, there are people living in that region before. It's only the creation of Freetown was part of what we know today as Sierra Leone. Was the place that they was captured, conquered, and then started to develop. But there were people, Muslim actually, predominantly Muslim people, that were living in that region.
Would you just point to us on the map where Sierra Leone is?
Yes, I don't know if you can see, it's so very tiny. Sierra Leone. So this is Liberia here, which has an interesting story with America. Sierra Leone is right here. Sorry, this is the really small map. And I grew up here, Nigeria.
Okay.
Wow. So it's a very tiny, very coastal. So it's did I see another hand?
Yes, I just had a question about Liberia, but you answered
Okay.
it. So I'm good.
Yeah, Liberia has an interesting story with the U.S. as well. Okay. Now, one of the famous schools that was built in 1827 in Freetown, Sierra Leone, is the Furabe College. Now, before this was built, there were what we call secondary schools, like high schools, kind of, sort of, that were already present, built by British government in connection with the Church Missionary Society, CMS. But then they also wanted a school that will train not only, introduce people to Western education, but a school that will train priests and teachers. And so in 1827, the Church Missionary Society founded the famous Furabe College. Sometimes it's called the Athens in Africa. It was actually the very first school in tropical Africa to award a first degree. So first in tropical Africa, the very first. I think in 1827, 1829, he had was affiliated with the University of Durham in England, so could award degree because of that affiliation. It became also a very important center. People like Samuel Ajayi that I talked about went to school. In fact, he was the very first student because he was taken to India. And then once this was founded, he was returned, brought back, and he studied there. Here's what, again, my mentor, Andrew F. Wall, said about Sierra Leone. For nearly half a century, that tiny country, Sierra Leone, sent a stream of missionaries, ordained and lay people to the Niger territories, Nigeria, so the Niger area. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Niger expeditions, the Abeokuta area and all the rest of it. That area was vast and diverse, Muslim emirates in the north, ocean trading city-states in the Delta area, very close to where I grew up. The vast Igbo population, I am an Igbo, in between. Sierra Leone is a very important center, very, very important center. So I want to zero in now on the mission churches, what it was like, and why those Africans in the late 1800s wanted to start a church that would tackle the kind of problems they saw within the mission-founded churches. Okay? So the mission-founded churches were the churches that were founded by missionaries from Europe and the Western world. Since we're dealing with the Church Missionary Society, we're going to focus on the Anglican Church and we're going to focus on Britain. One of the major problems that many of these people saw, in fact, in a sense, I was born, I'm just turning to 40 years old. But in a sense, I felt that too. Think about it. From the 1800s to the time that I showed up in the world. There was a problem what these people saw as overt and suffocating missionary control. They wanted to be the pastors of the local church. They wanted to control everything, the mission expansion, the personnel, the liturgy, even the style of worship, even the names. If you become a Christian, you adopt a Christian name, usually you adopt a foreign name. It's one of the reasons why my name is Viktor. Viktor is not a Nigerian word. It's an English word. Okay? So around late 1800, a lot of these African Christians felt, no, this wasn't right. Okay? Can we be truly Africans and at the same time truly Christian? Or do we have to abandon everything African in order for us to become Christians? And again, let's be honest about this. It wasn't an easy thing to do. Because on the one hand, the missionaries wanted to preserve what they considered the pure gospel. They didn't want it to be contaminated with the African traditional religions and culture. So there was something they were up to. They wanted to protect that. But the way they went about it, though, they didn't quite turn out well. In fact, I think it did more harm than good. Mission-founded churches did not empower African Christian leaders. In fact, even when Samuel Ajayi, we are going to come back to, was eventually made the bishop, many of the missionaries wrote back and said, and when I was in my doctoral dissertation at the University of Edinburgh, I had time to look at some of the archival materials, the letters, the exchanges. Sometimes I leave the archival room and I'll be crying because it's difficult to do. Many of the missionaries said it was an insult for Western or European missionaries to serve under an African mission. So even when he was made a bishop, he just did it. And finally, of course, they overthrew him. What he fought for, Samuel Ajayi died with a broken heart. Because everything he worked for, an African church led by African Christians, before his eyes, were taken out of his hand. As soon as the Church Missionary Society dethroned Samuel Ajayi and enthroned a young English bishop, The Anglican Church only had, that happened in 1890. The next time there was an African bishop was in 1955. 1890 to 1955. Oh, very bad. But we'll come back to that in a minute. It was an ambivalent attitude of missionary agencies towards colonial powers. Now, I use the word ambivalent because some of my colleagues, not Christian, people who work in my African studies, think that I'm being too nice. Because some think that it was clear that the missionaries, once it favored them, they had good relations with the colonial powers. I thought it was, the more I studied that, it became clear to me that it was more complicated than that. It wasn't a straightforward relationship with the colonial powers. But again, many Christians in Africa felt that the type of relationship between missionaries and colonial powers needed to be separate because the colonial powers they saw as evil. The presence, the taking of people's resources by force, the arbitrary mapping of Africa. I mean, take for example Nigeria, a name that was given by a British woman. If I took you there, you would probably think that you were in 3 different countries. If you go to the southeast where I grew up, the eastern state, the culture, the language, everything is different. If you went to the north, the language, everything is different. To the west, everything is different. In fact, one of my colleagues, Sam Zalanga, who grew up in the northern region, the first time he went to the eastern region where I grew up, he wrote that he had entered into a new country without a visa. Because it was entirely. So the arbitrary mapping was also a problem. The mission-founded churches also lacked African identity because they wanted to turn Africans into Europeans. The style of worship, the style of dressing. In fact, I remember the very first time I grew up in an evangelical church when a particular pastor wanted to preach without the white collar. He was almost disciplined. He said, "No, I'm going to wear an African style. What is wrong with wearing an African cloth when I preach?" I remember also getting into trouble when I suggested, when I was a very young Bible theology student in Nigeria, and I said, "How about we do our Holy Communion with the kind of wine that is made locally, not a foreign?" And everybody thought I was a heretic. So they had okay, so the condemnation of many of African traditional practices are without viable alternatives. Throw away all your charms and don't pour libations to the local gods. But then what was the alternative? For most of these missionaries was, well, once we civilize them, they're not going to worry about that. Okay? It's all about educate them, teach them about American or European style of education, and they will forget about these libations. It was bad, okay? And because even up to today, many Christians in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, suffer with what I call religious schizophrenia, in the sense that double-mindedness. On Sundays, everybody will rejoice. During the week, they're free to go to their local deities. When they think that Jesus Christ is too slow to answer their prayers, they find alternatives. Part of my dissertation was researching, studying different Christian communities, lived among them. And I think part of it is because of the non-constructive way of dealing with those practices. They thought that they could easily replace them with European culture. Africans are deeply religious. Their culture is closely related to their way of life, to their religion. So you can't just separate them. You can't neatly separate them. Like over here, we can think about the church and state. Not that. Your religion, your politics, your culture are all interwoven. several years ago, there was an election in my state, in the state that I grew up, Anambra State. Between two of them were Roman Catholics. One claimed that the election was rigged, and the other said, "How about we go to court? We settle the case." And the guy said, "I'm not interested in going to court. Both of us are Roman Catholics. How about we go to the Vatican City and take an oath in the presence of the Pope?" I'm good. You see it? Political issue. That if we can take an oath in the presence of the Pope, now settle religion, politics. And so it is part of the way they are wired. Somebody described religion in Africa as skin. Okay? You take it with you everywhere. You can't take it off and put it on the back. It's part of who you are. Okay? Any questions before we go to the famous Samuel Ajayi crowd? The Nigerian. And this is the map of Nigeria. And he grew up in Oyo State, and the old Oyo Kingdom. But any questions? Yes.
Is there any interaction between the Orthodox churches and then as the Iberian and British came in? Was there any interaction between those European mission-driven churches and the Orthodox?
Well, in 14, I think it was 1551 or so, Ethiopian, we're going back to Ethiopia, it's one of the examples of the Orthodox, Ethiopian Ephesus Orthodox Church. But in around 1450 something, one of the emperors, Ethiopian emperors, had asked for help for the Portuguese Christian Portuguese to come and assist them to fight off one of the invasion of Islam, which of course they showed up I think very late because the emperor died before they actually arrived. That was in the late 1400s. In the 1500s though, the Portuguese missionaries actually had contacts, and but of course they started to establish a church. They converted the mission. They established Christian communities there. But a few years later, they were kicked out. They were expelled from there because some people feared that it was messing with the Orthodox church. So there were some contact in the 1600s, but not in the massive way that they have in South Sudan. Okay, Samuel Ajayi Crowther, a Nigerian, when he was about 13, Muslim Fulani, remember the Sokoto Caliphate, were raided. They sponsored all sorts of raids in this part of the world and in that part of Nigeria. So when Samuel Ajayi was about 13 years old, the Fulanese Muslims had a raid, and he was captured. And his mother was captured. In fact, if you read the book you read about these experiences, it's really horrifying. How the Muslims killed the weak, and then of course took the strong and the young and sold them into slavery. Ajayi was passed into 6 different hands. Finally, he was sold to a Portuguese slave ship. Now we do know by this time that the British had already abolished the slave trade. So as he was making the journey with the Portuguese slave ship to Europe, the ship was intercepted by the British Navy and was rescued, and he was returned to Freetown, Sierra Leone. Okay. There he studied, and also, of course, we go to England, St. Mary's Church, and then we'll come back once Furabe was established in 1827 to complete his education there. And when he was done, he started teaching at that place as well. Okay. He was ordained in England as a priest in 1843 and appointed the head of the mission in Niger Territories in 1857. And something powerful happened in 1864. He was the first African to be made a bishop in that local church. It's a great Okay, but let's zero in on. So this is Samuel Jack Crowder. This was Henry Van, a very, very important figure in the Church Missionary Society. When he came on board, he had a vision for a church that is self-supporting, self-propagating. He wanted a church that would be led by Africans and also be supported by African church. And Samuel Ajay Crowder took him up on that. So he was Ajay Crowder was deeply shaped by Henry Van's vision for missions, which was a quite unusual thing. Okay? So it's a very, very important figure. So let's come down to Samuel Ajay Crowder then. His goal was to establish an African episcopate, an African church, a native pastorate that would be led by Africans. Again, this idea was already present in the vision of Henry Van. And these three principles he borrowed from Henry Van: self-governing, self-supporting, and self-propagating. He borrowed from Henry Van. This is what he wanted. And also, when it comes to the relationship between the church and society, he actually believed that commerce was really important, but only good commerce. So part of the things that he really fought against was slave trade. So if you really want Christianity to be effective in this part of the world at this time, you also need to have alternative source of income. Trade that has nothing to do with slavery. And it was I don't want to take a long detour here, but it was an interesting experience when some of the missionaries were proposing this idea of a native bishop, an African bishop. Some even say that it was better for West Indians, Africans who had close contact with Europeans, that they would be better off than Africans who were rescued. And the argument of the missionaries, I mean, I remember someone's coming back to me fresh. I remember going into those archives and reading these exchanges. And some of them, the missionaries, European missionaries, said that because those West Indies, Africans who live in close proximity, Europeans, they have studied European culture, they know European culture, they will be better off. Samuel Jack Crowder said that was precisely the reason why they shouldn't. Because the Africans who had not gone through this whole process of slavery are still close to their own culture. And many of them also were really willing to fight against slavery. So being a black or having a skin like Viktor doesn't automatically qualify you as someone who fights against slavery. So for him, he needed people who would support the idea of fighting against slavery. So Christianity was important. Commerce, so long as it was helping the expansion of Christianity, and so long as it was a clean trade. And education, which will, of course, help to bring about civilization. Now, some people are very critical of Samuel Jack Crowder because when he talks about civilization, he almost just did not quite take seriously African civilization. He was talking more about European civilization. Some people are very critical of him in that regard. Any questions about what Crowder was up to?
I guess I have a question.
Yes.
When you're talking about the slave trade in, was it the present day Nigeria? No, I'm sorry. Where was he referring to that he wanted the commerce to be slave trade free?
Oh, so in Sierra Leone was the base, remember
Sierra
Freetown,
Leone.
but they were also going into the Niger regions, Nigeria and especially Nigeria. So I'm going to talk about the Niger expedition in a minute. Yes.
I see. So, but was the slave trade so tangled in with all of the different businesses that it was hard to find a clean business, or was slave trade separate enough, distinct enough that he could definitely find people who were anti-slavery, totally clean, clean. Do you understand my
I
question?
do, I do. And remember, we're talking about 1800s.
Yes.
So even though it was illegal, some people were still doing it. I mean,
Yes.
that was why it was really sold into slavery.
Yeah.
So I remember that one of the things that slave trade did was that, apart from the Fulani Muslim race, but also people were capturing their fellow Africans and were selling them. They became part of that. In fact, my dad always tells us a very bad story. I never met with my granddad. And in a sense, I was happy that I never met him. Because he was probably very straight. My dad always tells us that his dad would say to him, because he didn't like to go to the farm, that if it was during the slave trade, that he would have sold him. Because if you are lazy, if you can't go to the farm, you're lazy. So the best thing. I remember each time he said that, we said, well, I'm glad I never met him. So remember, around that period, it was still a time. So and what Ajayi Crowther was promoting was cash crops. Okay, instead of slave trade, we can engage in all sorts of cocoa plantation, cash crop, and all the rest of them. So it wasn't. It required changing the orientation of Africans who were already making money in the coastal line, capturing their own fellow people and selling them into slavery. So it took a while to really change the mindset. There were better alternatives than selling people.
Thank you.
Okay, the Niger expeditions, again, the Niger area, most of them around this area actually, and eventually on Niger area where I grew up, the lower Niger and the upper Niger. The first attempt was in 1841, and Samuel Ajayi Crowther was part of it. It was explorative. They wanted to explore trade routes, alternative trade routes, but also wanted to go with missionaries. Ajayi Crowther was one of those people that went with them. It was disastrous because it didn't fly. They had all sorts of malaria problem, and finally they returned. In 1844, it was more successful. The second attempt, and then finally in 1857, a year later, the native church was founded. One of the things that Samuel Ajayi Crowther did was very powerful, was insisting that Africans didn't need to worship God in a foreign language. He was interested in the vernacular. He translated the Bible into the Yoruba language. He wrote, in fact, I think it was, as far as I'm aware of, he was the very first person to write a book about the Igbos. Cultures. This is not from my own ethnic group, but he wrote about that. He was a linguist. And he worked with German linguists to work on all sorts of things. Yoruba dictionary and all sorts of things. Because they believe that if people can hear and praise God in their own language, it is liberating. Sometimes I think that the Western missionaries probably underestimated the power of translation. Because when people were able to read the Bible in their own language, they went boldly to be critical of some of the ways of the missionaries. Like, well, we can read our own Bible. We don't have to depend on you to tell us what it says. We can read it. How can you reconcile what you're doing, your oppressive structures, and what we're seeing in the scripture? Giving people the opportunity to read and hear the gospel in their own language is very, very powerful. And you can connect that to the German Protestant Reformation too. Remember the translation of the Bible into the vernacular, German vernacular. So it was very, very powerful. Because of time, though, yes, go ahead. Why don't you go back?
You said in '57 they went in from Sierra Leone and established native churches.
Yeah, 50, yes.
Native to Africa. What was in Nigeria before? Were there Christian churches in Nigeria before, or was this the first introduction?
No, it wasn't. It was not. It was pretty much Muslims. So the CMS were actually the very first people to make that contact. I mean, there were some eventually by 1850. So around here, 1841, there was not really nothing. By 1854, though, I think the Baptists were already there, and then you have the Anglican Church and so on and so forth. By 18, Equa, I think it was 1883 or so. So here, around this time, there was nothing. In this exploratory, it was pretty much the local religions and Islam, because Islam was really present. So for him, as I said, the vernacular is essential to self-propagation and all the rest of it. His work on translation was very, very powerful. Allowed people to hear the gospel in their native tongues. He was Yoruba, so his native tongue was Yoruba. So it was very, very powerful. And it was very liberating too. Got him into all sorts of trouble too. Again, remember, just before we leave him and go to Prophet Harris, something happened. In the late 1880s, when the missionaries, because he established this native church and had native African priests, and he was the bishop already, because he was 1864 he was made bishop, so he was the bishop. And the Church Missionary Society did something that was interesting. They called him the Bishop of the Niger, but without specifying where. Did that include Sierra Leone? Or did that include Lagos? Was that just the upper region? Some of the Western European missionaries succeeded in convincing the Church Missionary Society to have another white bishop that would be in charge of Sierra Leone and even part of Nigeria, Lagos area. So without Bishop actually knowing, his influence or his power constantly was diminished. There were some charges that were brought against the native church and the leadership. And a young guy from Cambridge, most of them were in their late 20s and early 30s, were brought up from the UK to investigate the case. The report they had was really damning, and they smuggled the report out of Nigeria, out of Sierra Leone, back to London, without even letting the bishop know. So he only knew when it was already published in London. Again, I remember reading that some of the sections of the decisions. They say that they have concluded that Africans were incapable of ruling the church. And so there was a need to bring in a European. And that was what happened in 1819. Samuel Jackra was already in his 80s. So he was deposed, and a young English bishop was in throne. So in a sense, everything he worked for, an African church led by Africans, he could see in his own eyes, in his old age, so he really died in the broken heart. And as I said earlier, the only time we had, the Anglican church had a native bishop was in the 1950s. I think it was 1950. Okay, any questions? Because we have here, I don't know if you can say this, but this is the king of the Niger region handing over some of the ancestral objects, like that one, and that one, and that one. But any questions before we go from Sierra Leone to Liberia? And then we'll wrap it up. Prophet William Wade Harris, born in Liberia, grew up in the Methodist Church, but then will eventually started movements. At that time, people there estimated there were hundreds of people that followed him. A few days ago, I checked on the website of the World Council of Churches just to see the official record of the Harris Church. The church he started is still in existence today. There are about 750 congregations, communities, and then over hundreds of thousands of people, members of the church. Okay? So a very important figure as well to think about African Reformation. The difference between him and Samuel Ajay Crowther was that Crowther wanted to reform the church, but from within the Anglican Church. Okay, there's no point starting an alternative church. We can reform the Anglican Church that is in Nigeria from within. Harris, though, although he didn't start that way, later will approve this establishment for another church that had nothing to do with the Methodists to be found there. Like Crowther, he also believed that the church in Africa lacked African identity, and the Europeans condemned some of those cultures without providing alternatives. He was put in prison for actually saying that it was better to be under the British colony than to be to be led by the pro-American leaders in Liberia. And he was thrown into jail while he was in prison. He believed that he received a vision, a revelation, and the angel Gabriel called him to be the prophet of God. His followers called him the Black Elijah. He rejected Western clothing, walked barefoot, the white, and the cross, the famous cross that he had, and all the rest of it. But let's just go through what he, because of time, how he wanted to reform the church. To reform the church from outside the mission from the churches. Okay? If we really want to get anywhere, we need to establish an alternative church. That was his approach. He encouraged his converts to build prayer houses, led by a minister and 12 apostles. Does that ring a bell? Okay. I mean, if you go to their churches, many of them are really very Old Testament minded. They read Hebrew Bible a lot. If you go to their services, some of the things you find in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, they practice as well. Like, take off your shoes for where you're standing is a holy ground. You're a priest, usually. Don't wear shoes. He started the Harris movement, and today it's called the Harris Church. I think now they changed it to the Church of Christ Harris Vision. I think that's the new name now, but it's still the Harris Church. He was the first person to technically bring Christianity to Ivory Coast. Because when the Methodist Church missionaries arrived in Ivory Coast, they discovered that there were some people who had Bibles, and they talked about this black prophet. When he was kicked out of Liberia, he went to Ivory Coast. And then that was where he really ministered. Called for spiritual renewal and revival and condemnation of idol worship. He asked people to bring out their idols and they will set them on fire. Now, like unlike the missionaries who said, no, the only reason why they are pouring libations to their idols is because they are uncivilized. Just teach them Western way of thinking. They will eventually get out of it. For him, call people to bring their idols and set them on fire to burn them. But then he baptizes them without, teaching them, making them to go through a discipleship program. And the missionaries were so upset with him. But the reason why he did that was that the baptism signified spiritual purity and protection. So you set up something, your amulet on fire, but you need something to replace that. For him, the use of Bible, baptism, and were very, very important. He promoted fasting and prayer. And if you go to their church today, very important part of the way of life. A lot of fasting. Some of them will talk about 40 days fasting. 1 week, some talk about dry fasting, no water, nothing. Maybe for a week. So it's really part of their way of life as well. Before I wrap it up, I just want to think about some ways as we think about mission activities in Africa today. I should remind us that it used to be that Africa was called a dark continent, and mission was one-way traffic from Europe and west over to Africa. It's no longer the case. So now we talk about mission in reverse. Africans and Asians, I must say, are bringing missionaries to Europe and Latin America. most of the vibrant church communities in Europe are founded by Africans. So it's no longer a one-way traffic. But does that mean that we shouldn't do mission in Africa? No. I think all we need is a change of mindset. Now, one of the early missionaries didn't really discern, at least in my judgment, the limits of their own culture because they were superimposing Western cultures on African cultures. It didn't work. It caused more. It did more harm than good because of their cultures, Africans will respect you. If you say, don't do that, take this particular culture, it's better than your own culture, because they are nice, they might say, okay, fine. But as soon as you step out of the house, they go back to what they were doing. So it's not, that idea of imposing foreign culture didn't work and it will not work. Because we can. We don't have to become, say, non-Africans in order for us to be Christians. One way to think about it is that imagine that a missionary from Africa came to this part of the Twin Cities and preached the gospel, and some people believe as a result of the preaching of these African missionaries, and then he said to them, you know what, for you to show that you're a real Christian, you need to change your American name to an African name. And we're going to say, no, thank you. So it's really important to have that mindset. And please take time. Most of those early missionaries had zeal, but didn't really have any experience in cultural anthropology. So they really didn't pay attention to studying worldviews. But once they began to think about translation work, he opened them up to African culture. Because language, is powerful. It introduces you to the culture of the people. So he opened it up. So understand the worldviews of Africa. One example is that for the Africans, the spiritual world and the physical world have a symbiotic relationship. You can't separate them. So you need to think about that. And I think we also remember the early ones, this idea of teacher, student, Africans as the student, we are people from Europe, the teachers. We do really need to replace that and think about partnership. There are things that Christians in Africa can learn from Christians in America. And there are things Christians in America can learn from Christians in America. I remember when I moved over here, I started praying. I said, Pastor, son, you pray around 8 o'clock in the morning. Everybody does family prayer. You don't get out of it, okay? Even if you see a sick, you come out and you still pray with the family. When I moved to Wheaton College, because of all my assignments and different things, I stopped praying. I remember I called my mom, and the first question she asked me was, she never calls me Viktor at all, she calls me my Nigerian name. And she said, how is your prayer life? Great. I lied. And she caught me. That was the weakness. As a pastor's son, I saw it time and time again where people are sick, they want the pastor to pray first before they go to the hospital. So God being part of this process of healing and health. Over here, sometimes we only think about God when the doctor says there's nothing else I can do. So now we can talk about it. So there are things that we can all learn from each other. Okay, I want to stop here. The constructive mindset is let's not think of African culture as what we should destroy, but think of a constructive way to ennoble, to make better our culture, rather than we just destroy it, replace it with something. Sorry, it's a lot to talk in an hour, but any last questions before we finish? Yes.
What about your personal journey as a pastor's son? Going up in Nigeria, and how did you end up at Bethel in Minneapolis, Minnesota?
Oh, okay. Well, I did my first degree, undergraduate degree in Nigeria. Some of my professors taught at Wheaton College. So I did my first master's at Wheaton College in Illinois. I left the US, I went to Europe, to the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. I did another master's degree and my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. While I was finishing up, I saw an opening at Bethel. I applied. Got it. Thank you. It's a short version of a long. Yeah, but God, He was, God, I didn't want to be a theologian or have anything to do with the preaching. My dad was a pastor. Pastors, not these days pastors, because some pastors in Pentecostal churches are very wealthy. Many of them have 2 private jets. My dad, evangelical pastor, was poor, so we didn't really have enough money. And I loved what he did, didn't want to be a pastor, and I wanted to be a lawyer. When in Nigeria, you can do law degree as your first degree, unlike in the US, where you do your first degree and then you go to law school. The British system, you can do your first degree. And that was all I was wanting. But long story short, a lot of things happened in my lives, and my mom told me, perhaps God is holding me accountable for the promise I made to Him. I said, what promise? In Africa, women want to have male children. Again, it's one of those things that needs to be changed. I have 2 elder sisters. My mom, my pastor's wife, still wanted a male child because then she could feel she's not part of the family. When according to her, she made promises and said, if you will give me a male son, I will return the son to you as Hannah did Samuel. Mm-hmm. When I showed up and then I started acting up because and she said,
because your mom?
And then she said, maybe God is holding me accountable for what and I said, no, I don't want to be a pastor. And she said to me, do you want to be a lawyer? I said, yeah, but you said you can then be a lawyer for God. I said, okay, sure, I can be a lawyer and support God's work. She said, no, you could be a theologian and defend God's work. Long story short, I challenged God. I don't ask anybody to do it. But I said to God, it was a terrible thing. It was out of rebellion. And I said to God, if you really want me to teach theology or do Bible, my parents have no money, you provide money. Out of rebellion. And it's almost like God said, you know what? You got it. From my first degree to my PhD, all of them have been on scholarship. All. No exception. First degree, first master's degree, second master's degree, PhD. So it's almost like, okay, is that what you want? So now when I teach, I talk about theology, I do it as ministry because, Thank you so much.